Tier 4, the Alliance History Books. This is potentially the largest tier of the iceberg. Every alliance has its own history and perspectives, and this is where they fit. They are obscure enough that most players will never know about them, but not so obscure that they can't be learned. Number 1. The Wiki Lies. A lot of people use the wiki to learn the game's history, so it might be shocking to learn it's full of lies and inaccuracies. Firstly, most wiki pages are short and only list the alliances involved and the outcome. If an alliance has a lot of victories, it may give you the impression they're very powerful. In reality, those wars are expensive and their opponents are likely much weaker than them. Secondly, anyone can contribute to the wiki and there's almost no fact-checking, so the more obscure the page is, the more likely it is to be false. Thirdly, history is written by the victors and the most powerful alliances. Every time you see more than 2 lines of text on an important wiki page, it is either spouting propaganda or some top 5 alliances version of events. Finally, alliances do not own their wiki pages. If you read something on an alliance's wiki page, there is a high chance it is deliberate misinformation intended to hurt that alliance. Number 2. We are all Rose. In 2017, then Alex updated the game and accidentally made it so when you looted another nation, you got 40% of their resources instead of 14. To fix this bug, he had to put every nation in the game into one alliance for a few hours, and he chose Rose. Thus, every nation that existed in 2017 was once a member of Rose. Number 3. The Bipolarity version of history. Some people believe that politics and war has always been divided into 2 coalitions that fight each other for control of the game. One of the coalitions is considered the Established Powers, and one of them is considered the Rising Powers. I'll briefly recap the names of the coalitions and what their status was at the time. The format is Rising Power versus Established Power. There was Marionette versus Covenant, Marionette versus VE, Paragon versus Syndicate, Covenant versus Syndisphere, Paracov versus Syndisphere, Paracov 2.0 versus Syndisphere, the Inquisition versus Syndisphere, the Inquisition versus Easy Mode Coalition, Easy Mode Coalition versus the game, the Inquisition versus the game, Rose versus Syndisphere 2.0, and most recently, Celestial versus Hollywood. That may sound like a jumble of words, but there's a lot of continuity between the coalitions. Some alliances have been on the side of the Established Powers for almost a decade. A perfect example is the Syndicate. They formed in 2014 and didn't lose a war until 2020. And they weren't hiding in the shadows. They were in the top 5 alliances that whole time. They fought and won 13 global wars in a row. Number 4. Paracov versus Syndisphere. There were 3 coalitions in politics and war's early history: Covenant, Paragon, and Syndisphere. Covenant launched a war against Syndisphere and lost. Paragon launched a war against Syndisphere and lost. Covenant and Paragon united to launch a war against Syndisphere, and they lost. People remember these wars because Syndisphere was outnumbered and on the defensive, but they still won. The lesson people remember from these wars is that the quality of members really matters. There is also a stigma associated with the alliances that were in Paracov. It doesn't matter how many wars they win, they're still considered incompetent. The Inquisition versus Easy Mode Coalition. This conflict still defines most alliances. I mentioned in part 1 that the new Pacific Order invades games and tries to dominate them. Well, when they showed up in politics and war, then the Syndicate was already dominating the game, with their allies in Syndisphere. MPO should have instantly lost and been a footnote in history, but half of Syndisphere defected and joined with MPO to create the Inquisition. Some alliances in the Inquisition just wanted to trade one tyrant for another by replacing TS with MPO. Others wanted to end Syndisphere's hegemony and planned to split from MPO once they'd defeated the top alliances. The Inquisition launched its war against Syndisphere in mid-2017, and they lost. The Syndicate then became a neutral alliance, and the Syndisphere reorganized itself into Easy Mode Coalition, led by the Knights Radiant. The conflict spanned a number of years, and the names and existence of both coalitions was called into doubt pretty often. There's a lot of history beyond that, but it's not really necessary to understand the conflict. The Inquisition ultimately failed like Paracov, and they're remembered for being totalitarian at the end and losing the propaganda war. Number 6. UPN's Hegemony. UPN was once the strongest alliance in the game. They led the Covenant, which was considered a hegemony in 2014. Which, if you think about it, means only UPN and TS have ever been hegemons in PNW. Both of them live in the shadow of that success to some extent, but it's more obvious with UPN, who has fallen very far, and whose time in the sun was a very long time ago. Number 7. Mensa HQ. Mensa HQ was an old alliance that came from the game E-Republic, and they pioneered a lot of strategies which most major alliances employ today. They were one of the first alliances to seriously tier their members. This meant keeping all of their members at the exact same city count so that they would outnumber their opponents who were more spread out. They also increased taxes to 100% after wars, so that they could rebuild every nation in their alliance really quickly. Mensa HQ disbanded in 2016, but their strategies lived on, and they are still remembered for being some of the best fighters in Syndisphere. Some people might say that the Syndicate owes lots of its success to Mensa HQ. Number 8. Terminus Est. Terminus Est was a paperless alliance, a pirate alliance, and a mercenary alliance. They had some of the best fighters in the game's history, and amassed most of the largest nations at the end of 2016, before being destroyed by Syndisphere. Prefontaine, the former leader of Terminus Est, returned to the game a few years ago, and currently manages the game's development team. A group of large nations also revived Terminus Est, though it has nothing in common with the original. Number 9. Mercenary Alliances. Most players cannot name a mercenary alliance other than Arrgh. This is partially because being a mercenary alliance has become unpopular, but it's also because a lot of top 30 alliances do mercenary work in secret. The Golden Horde is a good example. They were paid to fight in several wars, but no one realized because they were vocal critics of whoever they were attacking. They didn't behave like mercenaries. Children of the Light is another example. They were paid to fight in one major war and kept it incredibly secret because it would damage their credibility if it was discovered. Number 10. TCW betrays TKR. The Commonwealth is well known for betraying its allies. I don't think that's unfair to say. But their biggest and most consequential betrayal is almost entirely forgotten. Before the Great War of 2019, then the game was trying to switch from bipolarity to multipolarity. Instead of just having 2 big coalitions, we'd have 6 or more. The Commonwealth was going to be abandoned by its ally the Knights Radiant, and sign treaties with the United Purple Nations, Acadia, and Frontier Records to form the Covenant bloc. During this transition, the Commonwealth realized that it would be the weakest coalition in the game. This was unacceptable, and they felt betrayed by the Knights Radiant, so they decided to do some betrayal of their own. They formed the Covenant, but then immediately signed a treaty with the Black Knights, making them the most powerful bloc in the game. This angered TKR and a lot of other alliances and prompted the Commonwealth to then draft war plans against TKR. A government member of the Commonwealth then leaked those war plans, which was the catalyst for the Great War. Number 11. Rose backs out of its treaty with BK. An addendum to the previous betrayal is Rose's betrayal of the Black Knights. They were meant to sign a treaty during the switch from bipolarity to multipolarity, but negotiations were tough, and ultimately Rose backed out, and it left BK available and willing to work with the Commonwealth. If this betrayal didn't happen, then the Great War would have been avoided. I'm sure you're wondering why the deal fell through. Well, the Black Knights were meant to cancel all of their other allies, and they didn't feel it was fair that Rose got to keep some of theirs. The Black Knights were likely to do it and go through with the deal though. Rose had an ideological issue with the Black Knights. They saw them as dangerous rivals. This led an old member of Rose to stage a protest and threaten that if Rose signed the Black Knights, then more than a dozen of Rose's largest nations would leave. Rose was nervous about signing the Black Knights when they were at full power. They couldn't even imagine signing the Black Knights with only half their power. It would mean becoming a follower instead of being in charge. Number 12. The Coalition A discussions. I'm not mentioning events from the Great War since that would be a video unto itself. I'm talking about the discussions between the winners of the Great War. At the tail end of the Great War, then Coalition A was consolidating its power, and this meant signing a lot of treaties between alliances in it, and merging alliances together. This made sense during the war, but the entire enemy coalition was destroyed, and afterwards this consolidation threatened to stagnate politics and ruin the game. Most of the alliances in Coalition A split up and went their separate ways so they could continue to sign treaties and fight one another. But the Syndicate, the Knights Radiant, and a handful of other alliances stayed together to form Quack. Quack was the strongest alliance in the game, and it led to a series of debates between former members of Coalition A over what the game should look like. Quack's argument was that it lost a lot during the Great War and felt threatened by the other members of Coalition A. They wanted people to prove themselves trustworthy by leaving them alone for a long time. It didn't work out, and the rest of Coalition A combined their strength to defeat Quack and reaffirm that multipolarity and lots of small coalitions was what most people wanted. The number of coalitions we have now is owed to those debates and that war. Oh, and there's still a lot of bitter feelings in former Quack alliances that feel like the rest of Coalition A was out to get them. Number 13. Scheduled political reorganization. This isn't one event, it's a repeating phenomenon. After major wars, then a bloc will disband and the alliances in it try to find new allies. This leads to every other bloc gaining members or being pulled apart and reorganized. Increasingly, alliances are seeking new allies before the war ends, so they're not blindsided after it. As a consequence, then most of the large alliances are prepared to sign their new treaties immediately after the war. The game's treaty web and politics changes in a second, and there's rarely a public explanation for it. It almost looks random. Predicting what spheres will be forming and trying to get into the better ones is what the most talented diplomats spend most of their time doing now. Number 14. Poaching Alliances. Some alliances are founded with the intention of poaching members from rival alliances or spheres. Sometimes they do this by encroaching into another alliance's niche, but often it's by bribing former government members of that rival to poach members. Famous examples of these include the Enlightenment, which was meant to poach members from Coalition B during the Great War, and Eclipse, who has a track record of poaching members from Camelot. The Enlightenment became Children of the Light, and eventually Cataclysm, which is now a top 10 alliance. Eclipse is also a top 10 alliance that has outgrown the alliance they were originally designed to poach from. Number 15. Cybernations Origins. More than 30% of the major alliances have their roots in Cybernations. Hell, a lot of alliances have the same names they did in Cybernations. The United Purple Nations was the United Purple Nations in CN. Polaris was the New Polar Order in CN. The Syndicate has a lot of members that were in MI6, an alliance in CN. Grumpy, Dark Brotherhood, and others were from the Viridian Entente in CN. Rose and the Commonwealth both have members from the Green Protection Agency in CN. Arrgh has members from the Random Insanity Alliance in CN. The Immortals has several members from the New Pacific Order in CN. And I think the Knights Radiant's founder was also the leader of Mushroom Kingdom in CN. Gato, Legion, WTF, Fargistan, R&R, and a bunch of others are also from CN, and didn't even change their name. Number 16. Former Guardian. A lot of the game's most famous diplomats came from Guardian. Prefontaine, Kigos, and Abbas are just a few of them. This is fascinating because Guardian isn't politically proactive. For the past few years, they have just been following their allies. Number 17. Rose Favoritism. Alex was once a member of Rose in another game, and there are some people who suggest he favors them a bit because of that. I mentioned earlier that everyone in the game got put in Rose to fix a bug. Well, he could have put them in any alliance to fix it. He chose Rose from the crowd. SS23, who helps manage the game's server, is also from a Rose. Number 18. Pantheon and Immortals Connection. Pantheon was an alliance themed around Greek mythology, and well known for being more interested in economics than war. Tyrion, the head of IA and Pantheon, left and founded an alliance named the Immortals, which was based on Egyptian mythology and Persian history. The Immortals has a lot of similarities to Pantheon. They are a direct successor, and you can tell that with a glance. They are much more resilient than Pantheon though, and unlike Pantheon, they want to be in charge, and they don't shy away from war. Number 19. Treasure Island. Treasures randomly spawn on nations and increase their alliance's revenue by 2%. However, having lots of treasures in one alliance only gets you 3 to 4%. Why is this? Well, a couple of years ago, then the Syndicate collected all the treasures in the game and founded an alliance called Treasure Island. and they merged their entire sphere into it. The bonus was like 30 to 40%. It was insane. This is partially why they were so much richer than their rivals, and other alliances that were left out of Treasure Island. Rose was technically an ally of the Syndicate, but they were excluded because they had the potential to be a rival. The Black Knights was also an ally of the Syndicate, but they didn't want to join, something they later regretted. Number 20. 1 credit alliances. It used to cost 1 credit, $5 to create an alliance. This prevented new alliances from forming and, in my opinion, stagnated the game's growth by preventing people from becoming involved in the game's politics. To create an alliance now, you only need 1,000 score. And the reason that's the case is because the bigger alliances don't want new players creating alliances when they don't know the game. Number 21. Alliance trademarks. Some alliances have unofficially trademarked certain names, and that can generate conflict. An example of this is R&R, which was an alliance in Cybernations. The alliance disbanded and the members went their separate ways, but one of the members, Dreadnought, recreated the alliance in Politics and War, and angered all the others. Number 22. Alliance hostages. An extension of this trademarking is when alliances are taken hostage to prevent others using the name. For example, the Viridian Entente was one of the most famous alliances in the game, and Carthago and the Syndicate both despised them. Carthago had one of their members steal the name so the Viridian Entente could never reform under their old name. Number 23. Special IDs. Some alliances also try to capture special alliance IDs. Camelot got 8888, but lost it, Hand of Fate got 9,000, and 10,000 was also especially coveted. Number 24. Market flooding. The market never has more than 500 trade offers because despite the game's large population, not many people actively trade. Alliances have in the past taken advantage of the limited number of trade offers in a few different ways. The most common is buying every resource for sale and relisting the resources for a higher price. A more obscure strategy was Camelot's Food Blitz. They got every member of their alliance to spam 5 to 10 food trades, each for 1 unit at a very low price. This doubled the number of trade offers on the market and had a few side effects. Firstly, people that were cheating by automating their nations to trade lost billions. Their scripts would review the average price of resources and post a trade offer lower than that, but because the average price was artificially lowered, their resources were on sale for a ridiculously low price. Secondly, it made buying resources very inconvenient, because you had to scroll down several pages. In the wake of the Food Blitz, then the admins made it so that if you posted 2 trades of the same resource for the same price, they were merged into one, and after several years, they have now capped the number of trade offers each nation can have. Number 25. The TFP Arrgh Treaty. Arrgh was once allied to the Fighting Pacifists. Arrgh is the most famous pirate alliance in the game, and people assume they have never had any treaties. The Fighting Pacifists was a pacifist alliance for a very long time. In fact, raiding another nation would get you kicked out. They could not be more dissimilar if they tried. Arrgh was also allied to FARC and World Task Force at different points in time. I can find evidence for most of this except their treaty with TFP. For that, I am relying on the word of TFP's leaders, though they have no reason to lie. Number 26. Occupy TFP. Terminus Est once occupied the Fighting Pacifists, by just repeatedly attacking all their nations that grew above a couple thousand score. This devastated TFP, and almost destroyed their alliance. We have never seen it happen again, which speaks to how unjust the community felt it was. Number 27. Years, not months. The big alliances think in terms of years, and not months, weeks, or days. They don't care about raids or small insults, or anything else. They are competing in a long-term game against one another, where only the next war, the next change in their numbers, matters. They'll even deliberately lose wars if they think it'll allow them to get ahead in the long term. This mentality is especially visible in their alliance histories, when they have them. New or small alliances will list the major events in their history, and their identity will be the sum of those successes and failures, whereas the big alliances will list the errors of their alliance, and often each era will end when they switch from being in a powerful coalition to being in a weaker one, or vice versa. Number 28. Camelot founded Royal. 2 members of Camelot originally created Royal Obus News, which became the largest news server in the game. They also pioneered the short announcement style of news in politics and war. Eventually they got busy, and Royal changed hands several times before coming into possession of Carthago, who was extremely critical of Camelot there. Royal did try to hide its origins under the new management, but has given up by this point and accepted its history. Number 29. San Marino, or the Fighting Pacifists. The Fighting Pacifists never created a custom flag. Instead, they used the flag of San Marino, which is in the game by default. Because San Marino isn't well known, a lot of people probably associate the flag with the Alliance, and not the country, and will for many years to come. Number 30. The oldest alliances in the game. 7 Kingdoms and Guardian both formed on the 5th of August 2014, and are the oldest alliances in the game. However, Politics and War also had a speed round and other things prior to the official launch, so technically other alliances are older or equally as old. UPN also participated in the speed round, and they might have even won it. Number 31. The CS and KT merger. Cornerstone was a Christian alliance that merged into the Black Knights in 2018, after its government went inactive. However, many of their members chose to join the Knights Templar instead, because of their shared Christian theme. This is somewhat funny because those alliances could not have been more different. Frankly, many a Cornerstone member probably left after a week, swearing KT was unholy. Number 32. Deoism. There are only 2 well-known religions in Politics and War, Deoism and the Faith of the 11. Deoism is definitely the more well-known, and it originated in E-Republic and was brought over by Mensa HQ. In E-Republic, then a player named Dio from Pakistan rallied the entire game's community to invade Sweden. Number 33. Global War 15. In the early days of Politics and War, then after Globals, the winning coalition would create an informal name for the war to use in discussions. When the wiki was created and people started recording history, then war names were decided by a vote on the forums. Everything changed with the Great War of 2019. The war went on so long that people needed a name for it before it ended, and both coalitions proposed different names. War names are often loaded with propaganda, or convey one side's argument or joke, so instead people started referring to it as Global War 14. It's generic but factually correct, and at the time no one else had named a war like that, so everyone knew what they meant. It got confusing when during every subsequent war, the wiki was named Global War 15, 16, etc., until a vote could be held after the war. Alex also moved the voting from the forums to in-game, which somehow reduced the number of people that voted, and meant random names were being chosen by people that were completely uninvolved. At this stage, the wiki staff seems to have given up, and the most recent global wars haven't been given proper names. They've just called 23, 24, and 25. There are 2 options moving forward. Option A is that the winners dictate the war's name in the peace agreement. Option B, people copy Camelot and create their own names for every war. Number 34. The VE War leaks. The Great VE War was a global war that started in 2015. The 7 Kingdoms, Guardian, and Mensa HQ wanted to roll the Viridian Entente, but they weren't powerful enough to do it alone, and an expensive war would have weakened them and allowed their rivals to prosper. 7 Kingdoms' plan was to ally Rose and attack VE. In that war, then Rose would be made to take the most damage. After the war, then 7 Kingdoms and DEIC would roll Rose, and then 7 Kingdoms would betray DEIC and roll them. By the end of it, 7 Kingdoms would reign as King of the Ashes. This is a crazy plan for world domination, but there's nothing to suggest it would have failed. The only reason it didn't happen was because the 7 Kingdoms explained it in detail on their forums, and that got leaked. And once it was leaked, Rose and the Viridian Entente rolled them for it. This is definitely the largest part of the iceberg. There is so much stuff which can be included under the subheading of Alliance history. Every alliance has its own wars and events which define it, and in their eyes, reshape the game. So I might make a part 2A of this section of the iceberg a long time from now, when I'm wiser and know more of the game's history. If you enjoyed this video, then like, comment, and subscribe. Most of my viewers are not subscribed, which is truly a tragedy. If they were, then my head would be at least 2 times bigger.